It is our pleasure to welcome you and gather together at the end of this long term, which began at the ashes of over 1.6 million hectares of forest in BC destroyed by wildfire, proceeded with an intense labor struggle that saw SFU impose austerity measures while allocating funds to paramilitary surveillance of students and union members, and came to its twilight with full-scale siege on Palestine and college campuses across North America, including SFU, bitterly struggling over our roles in this particular iteration of war. Embroiled and implicated in this context, I have the privilege of introducing our distinguished guest, Dr. Deb Cowen, to share from her current research on the entangled crises of climate, coloniality, genocide, and survivance. As we listen and ask questions, may we also do so feeling the full weight and significance of Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh struggles to preserve collective existence on their unceded lands where SFU Burnaby occupies and which all of our activities currently remake. Dr. Deb Cowen is a professor in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto. Deb's work is concerned with the intimate life of war in ostensibly civilian spaces, the logistics of supply chain and racial capitalism, and the contested geographies of settler colonial infrastructure. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. She's the author of 2 monographs, The Deadly Life of Logistics, Mapping Violence in Global Trade, and Military Warfare, the Soldier and Social Citizenship in Canada. She also co-edited the anthology War, Citizenship, Territory, and Digital Life in the Global City, Contesting Infrastructures. And with Catherine McKittrick and Simone Brown, co-edits the Duke University Press book series Errand Trees. I have also had the wonderful privilege of getting to know her as we have laid plans to get her here, and realize that she does not toot her own horn as a fierce and tireless leader organizing across various sectors and communities to combat crises crossing labor, ecological disaster, and genocide. Please welcome Dr. Cowen and think with her in this talk entitled Infrastructure for the Apocalypse, Palliative Politics Meets Colonial Lifeworlds. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. I will start just by not only thanking the staff that did all the hard work of booking and, well, logistics, which I have a lot of respect for, but also especially Sharon, who it is a rare and beautiful thing to have such an incredibly warm welcome and such a generative and thoughtful set of conversations leading up to even arriving here. So I want to thank you deeply for that. And of course, Maggie, whose work kind of anchors my presence here in some ways, and which has already been, before reading the current work, real inspiration, but continues to be so. And I'm looking forward to talking with you more tomorrow. And to all of you, especially the graduate students, who I just had a wonderful, not only generative, but also really sort of a restorative lunch with. I really appreciate that time. So I guess I just want to start by saying this work, this particular paper or talk, which is in part inspired by this quote specifically and some of the kinds of politics and affects that surround it, and I think that infuse it, is one attempt to try and articulate a very slow book project that broadly deals with the question of settler colonial infrastructure, but continues to move. And so my talk title shifted a little bit today from what you might have seen in the poster, but is broadly engaging the same themes. Okay, so I'll start. I've lived through something sharply, terribly painful here, wrote revolutionary writer, theorist, and organizer Rosa Luxemburg, from the cold captivity of a prisoner of war camp in then Breslau, now Wrocław, in December 1917. These words open a chilling letter that she wrote to her friend and fellow Socialist Party member Sophie Liebknecht in one of the most turbulent years in human history, just a year and a few weeks before Luxemburg would be assassinated. In the letter, Luxemburg describes the arrival of military supply wagons at the camp, quote, filled with sacks of old army coats and shirts, often with bloodstains on them, end quote. She explains how, quote, they're unloaded here and distributed to the prison cells, patched and mended, then loaded up and turned over to the military again. So sharply and terribly painful for Rosa on that December day, 106 years ago, was the beaten and bloodied condition of the animals pulling the military wagons for frontline battlefield supply. On this particular day, water buffalo replaced the usual horses at the helm of these heavy wagons. Their suffering became Rosa's. The soldiers complained that it was, quote, a lot of trouble to catch these wild animals and even more difficult to put them to work as draft animals. The once wild buffalo were, quote, accustomed to their freedom and had to be beaten terribly before they grasped the concept that they had lost the war, end quote. Luxemburg recounts the ferocity of the soldiers' lash, how, quote, the hide of the buffalo is proverbial for its toughness and thickness, but this tough skin has been broken. She notes that the abuse was far from exceptional and rather recounts how the buffalo were, quote, given meager and wretched feed. They are ruthlessly exploited, forced to haul every possible kind of wagon load, and they quickly perish in the process. Startling in this letter, breathtaking perhaps, is the intimacy of her solidarity with the water buffalo. Luxemburg recounts, quote, I stood before it, and the beast looked at me. Tears were running down my face. They were his tears. Luxemburg's suffering becomes not only entangled, but indistinguishable from the suffering of this beast, which in all its difference she names as kin. Quote, no one can flinch more painfully on behalf of a beloved brother than I flinched in my helplessness over this mute suffering. In her grief, Luxemburg points to the rhythms, the motions of life that had been overwhelmed by imperial warfare. She highlights the destruction of landscapes and ecologies that sustain interspecies life in full sensory motion. Quote, how far away, how irretrievably lost were the beautiful, free, tender green fields of Romania. How differently the sun used to shine and the wind blow there. How different was the lovely song of the birds that could be heard, or the melodious call of the herdsman. 3 years before writing this extraordinary but slightly obscure letter, Luxemburg published a different set of ideas. Her nearly 500-page work, The Accumulation of Capital, elaborates a theory of imperialism that is as intriguing and relevant as her reflections on intimate interspecies suffering. A core argument of this work regards the inherently expansionary logic of capitalism. For Luxemburg, capitalism is a system that relies on growth. Capitalism cannot sit still. It feeds specifically on expanding its reach and its grab. It is imperial to its core. Luxemburg builds on Marx in engaging capitalism as a system of expanded reproduction. For Marx, expanded reproduction is the sparest expression of capitalism. As capital circulates, it is accumulated. The reference to movement and circulation here is no accident. Thomas Nail writes, quote, for Marx, everything is in motion, not just capitalism. The issue for Marx is not between capitalist movement and revolutionary stasis. The question is how a specifically capitalist pattern of circulation works. Capitalism for Marx is a regime of motion defined by dispossession and exploitation. For Luxemburg, militarism is a weapon in the competitive struggle between capitalist countries. There's a quote. Militarism is a weapon in the competitive struggle between capitalist countries for areas of non-capitalist civilization. It is not magic that makes expanded reproduction possible, but theft. Theft is typically thought of in terms of labor surplus, but as Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard argues, if we take colonialism seriously, then expanded reproduction is also crucially about theft of land and more than human life. Primitive accumulation is perpetual. Luxemburg's communion with the buffalo and her meditations on imperialism are not typically thought together. Yet imperial circulation is already woven through this interspecies grief. The beating of the bloody buffalo is directly tied to the logistical life of empire. The buffalo is made into disposable machine of military logistics because the reproduction of warring empires relies on the mundane movement of materials. Logistics drives strategy and tactics. War is also a permanent feature of the smooth workings of capitalism because this logic of expansion necessarily breeds conflict, resistance, and struggle. But so too, Rosa's communion orients us towards the persistent accessibility of other ways of moving in relation to wider ecologies. A deep solidarity in suffering may even give shape to nourishing what Winona LeDuc and I call alimentary infrastructures. The remainder of this talk is dedicated to putting flesh on these conceptual bones. At the very same moment in time, but in a faraway place, the brutal force of imperial circulation was also intimately entangled with the buffalo to disastrous effect. In December 1917, as Luxemburg penned that powerful letter, the central plains of Turtle Island were in a protracted and violent process of transformation from indigenous ecology of abundance into a landscape of imperial genocide. Before colonization, Plains peoples and buffalo lived in kinship relations that created a vast continental ecosystem. Cree scholar Tasha Hubbard explains how buffalo were, quote, not just a food source, but also a relative and with knowledge to share. Pawnee, Missouri scholar Anna Lee Walters writes, quote, the buffalo brought order, teachings, values, ethics, aesthetics, and life. New literary forms and literature grew out of those associations. Robin Wall Kimmerer of the Potawatomi Nation looks to the wider ecological interdependencies of buffalo. She describes the process of compensatory growth where, quote, a herd of buffalo grazes down a sward of fresh grass. It actually grows faster in response. She describes how an enzyme in buffalo saliva stimulates grass growth and reminds of the fertilizer produced by a passing herd. We all know what that means. Grass gives to buffalo and buffalo gives to grass. The system is well balanced, but only if the herd uses the grass respectfully. Free-range buffalo graze and move on, not returning to the same place for many months. These indigenous ecologies were organized around the movements of and movements with the buffalo. The centrality of motion more broadly to indigenous life has been elaborated by many, including Anishinaabe scholar and writer Leanne Simpson, who writes, quote, Anishinaabe people traveled throughout their localized territories in seasonal fashion. Our lifeway required cyclical and rhythmical movements. Society and clan structure expanded and contracted like a beating heart or working lungs, end quote. Gerald Weisner, also Anishinaabe thinker and writer, his seminal work on the concept of transmotion posits that, quote, natives have always been on the move by chance, necessity, barter, reciprocal sustenance, and by trade over extensive routes. The actual motion is a natural right, and the tribal stories of transmotion are a continuous source of visionary sovereignty. But by 1917, the genocidal movement westward had so effectively devastated indigenous peoples and their buffalo ecologies that their movements had been consigned to a different kind of circulation as the face of colonial currency. And I forgot, but I actually have show and tell. Somewhere I have one of these coins to show you. I will do that after. Also, I'll keep you waiting while I ruffle through my stuff. Okay. Commenting on what's known now as the Buffalo Nickel, the DC Evening Star of January 13, 1917 reads, quote, long after the extinction of the buffalo, the buffalo nickel will continue to roam the continent. When asked to design the nickel, sculptor James Earl Fraser said, quote, it occurred to me that the buffalo, as part of our Western background, was 100% American, and that our North American Indian fitted perfectly into that picture. In The Colonizing South, or Home and Homelessness in Israel-Palestine, Hagar Kotef argues that colonial subjectivity doesn't rely on looking away from the violence that the colonizers cause, but also on attaching to it in defining ways. It was not simply colonialism, but colonial infrastructure and logistics that devastated plains ecologies. Through the second half of the 19th century, settlers undertook a brutal attack on the buffalo precisely to interrupt the motions of these wider ecologies. In just a few decades, settlers slaughtered at least 50 million buffalo in a gruesome logistical warfare on indigenous peoples' food supply. U.S. General Custer directed his men to, quote, kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone. General Sheridan is also blunt when he insists on destroying the indigenous commissary. And you can see here many American military officers made similar, very logistical kinds of comments about the destruction of the buffalo as the destruction of indigenous food supply. Likewise, James Dashuk has documented how with the disappearance of the buffalo, Canadian officials denied food as a means to quote, ethnically cleanse a vast region from Regina to the Alberta border as the railway took shape. Lands were cleared for the coming railroad, while the railroad also became a colonial weapon to clear the land. The rail cut through the herds like the blade of a table saw through wood. And you can actually see this, it's like a time map of the devastation of the herds. But that cut that happens in the 1889 to 1870 to 1889 period, that's a marker of the American Transcontinental Railroad passing through the plains. So you can literally see it on a continental map. So lands were cleared for the coming railroad, while the railroad also became a continental weapon to clear the land. The rail cut through the herds like a blade of a table saw through wood and served as a fast-moving machine gun. The rail compressed time and space for the movement of troops to war on a dehumanized plains peoples. When armed indigenous resistance to colonial dispossession took shape in the 1885 uprising, the Transcontinental Railroad transported Canadian militia forces to the front lines, providing the definitive logistical advantage. Infrastructure like railroads, pipelines, and dams enable and constrain configurations of motion, and so too of reproduction. In the 1980s, David Harvey argued that crises of capitalist motion can be temporarily resolved through a quote-unquote spatial fix, or the production of built infrastructure. In the 1990s, Doreen Massey argued that transportation and communication infrastructures produce power geometries, speeding up motion and connectivity for some, but in ways that erect barriers to the motion of others. Ruthie Gilmore has explained that in the material world, infrastructure speeds some processes, and this is a quote, and slows down others, setting agendas, producing isolation, and enabling cooperation. The late, great Lauren Berlant defined infrastructure as, quote, the movement or patterning of social form, and suggested that, quote, an infrastructural analysis helps us to see what we commonly call structure is not an intractable principle of continuity across time and space, but a convergence of force and value in patterns of movement that's only solid when seen from a distance. In April 1917, Henry Ford's automobile factories became critical infrastructure for the newly declared U.S. war on Germany. 2 years later, Henry Ford authored an anti-Semitic text accusing Jews of maintaining hidden but powerful conspiracies of global economic control. Hitler was a fan of both Henry Ford's 1919 work, The International Jew, and his mass production techniques. In this way, Ford is known to have helped inspire Adolf Hitler's 1925 Mein Kampf. Almost 2 decades later, the Nazi government would award him the Grand Cross of the Order of the German Eagle, the highest possible award for a foreigner. In that same year, Ford would establish subsidiary operations in Germany, investing significantly in an auto plant in Cologne that would run right through World War II, using forced labor from the Buchenwald concentration camp. Silverstein notes that the value of the German subsidiary more than doubled during the course of the war. Hitler saw America as a model for the Nazi race laws. James Whitman has assembled an extensive historical record showing how the Nazis looked directly to the U.S. for, quote, precedent and authority in the areas of borders and blood, and especially laws around citizenship and sexuality. Norman Rich looks at how American westward expansion, quote, served as the model for Hitler's entire conception of Lebensraum. In 1928, Hitler spoke admiringly about the ways Americans had, quote, gunned down the millions of Redskins to a few 100,000 and now keep the modest remnant under observation in a cage. In his memoir, Henry Ford credits the Chicago meatpacking plants for inspiring his auto assembly line. The logistification of killing in the meatpacking plants and the specific invention of the disassembly line emerged out of efforts to standardize the slaughter of the irregular, unique forms of animal life. As Commons wrote in 1904, it would, quote, be difficult to find another industry where division of labor has been so ingeniously and microscopically worked out. The animal has been surveyed and laid off like a map. Skill has become specialized to fit the anatomy, end quote. Putting meat in motion reduced the time to render an animal from 12 hours to 36 minutes. New scales of slaughter became possible, and the drive to efficiency saw everything between meat and the last breath become lucrative byproduct. The logistification of meat turned Chicago into, quote, the butcher of the world, a vile-smelling, deeply segregated, rapidly expanding industrial city. People came from all over the continent and the world to try and carve a living from packing town. Meat packers were the largest employers of black workers who were set up to serve as, quote, a visible daily reminder of the inexhaustible supply of reserve labor to which the packers could turn if confronted with labor unrest. In 1917, the Wobblies, International Workers of the World membership, hit its peak in transnational reach, but Chicago's meat packers and rail workers remained its home base. The Wobblies were unusual in the U.S. labor movement in their commitment to, quote, organize and unite the entire working class, regardless of skill, color, sex, or national origin. Mary White Ovington, founder of the NAACP, wrote, quote, there are two organizations in this country that have shown that they do care about the full rights of the, quote, Negro. It's historical language. The first is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The second organization that attacks Negro segregation is the Industrial Workers of the World. The IWW has stood with the Negro, end quote. The project of cross-racial solidarity made the IWW a threat and prompted the creation of new state surveillance infrastructure. Literally, the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was created in this time to respond to the threat of the Wobblies. Arrested, imprisoned, outlawed, and sometimes killed, their vision, practice, and organization nevertheless remains alive today. Chicago literally grew around the conjoining of beef, pork, and iron horse being the name that the railroad was given as it literally replaced horses for transportation. Rick Halpern explains how it was, quote, the railroad, that great engine of capitalist development that catapulted Chicago past Cincinnati as the country's preeminent meatpacking center. With Chicago as its hub, the rail network redrew the paths of commerce. He further traces how the city's packers, quote, contributed to the planning and finance of the first railroad systems radiating outward from the growing metropolis. Yet this push for efficiency on the killing floor relied on the logistification of meat supply far beyond those walls. High-speed supply of livestock was only possible because of genocide on the Great Plains and the violent efforts at wholesale replacement of continental indigenous ecology with enclosed, propertized landscape of livestock economy. High-speed demand for meat was only possible because the refrigeration of trains circulating between kill and consumption. No longer did entire animals have to be shipped live, heavy, and often mangled to the East Coast, when Chicago could slaughter more efficiently, replacing the craft of butchering with the tailorist tasks of meat cutting. What distinguished the cow from the buffalo was subsumption. Many commodities could be made from the buffalo: fertilizer for industrial crops, coats and rugs from hides, bone china plates and saucers that filled kilns and cupboards across Europe and the United Kingdom. Gruesome scenes that index the scale of continental transformation and the destruction of life underway took shape at railway cities across the plains. While commodities could be extracted from the carcasses of buffalo, the cow was born a commodity, domesticated, enclosed, and propertized. If, as Winona LaDuke suggests, the Anishinaabe have understood themselves as belonging to the buffalo, then the settler most certainly understands livestock as property. Literally living stock, these creatures are value stored live for later. Value stored live for later. Enclosure transforms the animal into livestock. Enclosure is what makes movable property. Fred Moten and Stefano Harney remind us that the combination of confinement and forced mobility is a signature of logistics when they look to the slave ship of the transatlantic slave trade as a key site for its genesis. The dehumanization of black people took the specific form of chattel slavery. Enslaved people were often compared, counted, transported, and sold as chattel, as movable property, as stock. When meatpackers brought black workers to Chicago from the South to undermine a massive labor action in 1894, they brought them in cattle cars. 20 years earlier, Charles Darwin reflected in his notes, quote, "Do not slaveholders wish to make the black man other kind, animals with affections, imitation, fear of death, pain, sorrow for the dead?" Darwin continues, "Animals whom we have made our slaves, we do not like to consider our equals." The words chattel and cattle have both come through Old French from the Latin caput, meaning head. They remain closely interlinked, and in colonial America, the rights over enslaved humans and livestock became, quote unquote, equalized. The term stock has long and complex genealogies that emerged out of deep entanglements with slavery. As a store of value, stock was often human life. Enslaved people were used as collateral for the first bond market in the United States. Early mortgages often trafficked in enslaved people rather than real estate. Stock also refers to a form of wood and leg enclosure, a logistical infrastructure of transatlantic slavery that brutally denied black mobility in the context of massive forced movement. Renowned Afro-Guyanese artist Stanley Graves created a work in 1966 that he described as his most important sculpture and possibly his most important work in any form. Slave stock, as the piece is known, mysteriously disappeared in the 1970s, but was recreated by the artist in 2018 when he was aged 85 years old. Last spring, he shared this reflection in an email exchange with my partner, Elisa Trotz. Quote, "Guyana National Museum has an old Dutch slave whip. Leather thongs are attached to a wooden handle. Each thong has copper wire bits attached, making it look like barbed wire. As a boy, I visited the museum when sent on errands in Water Street. Looking at the whip, I tried to imagine what it could be like to be whipped with it. You must have seen the infamous photo of the back of a slave in the United States. If not, check it out. That he survived is due to the spiritual energy of Africans. They dance for everything." In response to the recent description of Palestinians as human animals by the Israeli defense minister, Fred Moten insists on a political project that does not aim at resuscitating the human. He says, and I quote, "I can't prove my humanity. I don't want to prove my humanity. I am leery of humans. We live in the wake of the brutality of what humans do. I am much more interested in the idea of, quote, species reassignment than species reaffirmation." It was not in October of 2023, but back in 1917 that legal infrastructures of Palestinian dehumanization were crafted by imperial power in the form of the Balfour Declaration. This public British pledge declared its aim to, quote, establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. As Rashid Khalidi writes, quote, "The overwhelming Arab majority of the population, around 94% at that time, went unmentioned by Balfour. They were described in terms of what they were not, and certainly not as a nation or a people. The words Palestinian and Arab do not appear in the Declaration." In a 1988 interview, Edward Said explains that, quote, the term, quote, two-legged animals was common referent for Palestinians. If colonization of the Great Plains replaced an ecology anchored in buffalo motion with a logistical landscape organized around industrial livestock, contemporary logistics reaches far beyond the movement of meat from the feedlot to the slaughterhouse. Today, logistics reconfigures the very biology of life that is governed as livestock. For supply chain management, The cow is but one stage of beef as commodity in the cycle of value realization and profit maximization. Life cycle has been reorganized so that the animal fits the system of motion. As one industry textbook explains, quote, logistics, not science, is the underpinning of a successful breeding policy, unquote. This includes everything from ovulation synchronization for reproductive efficiency, to the timing of insemination and the weaning of cows to fit trucking schedules themselves organized to maximize efficiency at processing facilities. Along with hospitals, prisons, and distribution centers, meat processing plants were ground zero for pandemic outbreaks, with striking impacts on workers who are precarious, largely migrant and of color. Working conditions and productivity demands in the sector make meaningful distancing impossible, and this combined with the lack of provisioning of PPE, wider social determinants of health of precarious workers to disastrous effect. The outbreaks led to plant closures and enormous bottlenecks in the profoundly industrial and logistical meat sector. In the United States and elsewhere, the infection and premature death of packing house workers have been a source of quote-unquote supply chain disruption, a term we hear a lot. Massive and not at all humane culls of millions of animals have been one of the gruesome costs, sometimes by disrupting air circulation, turning off ventilation systems, the critical infrastructures that supported livestock breath to produce mass, slow suffocation. This remaking of livestock biology is at once the remaking of ourselves, with devastating consequences that concentrate in the gut. In 2023, international news media carried headlines of rapidly rising rates of colorectal cancer in young adults. Rates in American adults under 55 years jumped from 11 to 20% of all cases, and 60% of new cases are now advanced stage cancer. Colorectal is now the leading cause of cancer deaths for Americans 20 to 49 years old. African Americans are 20% more likely to get colorectal cancer and about 40% more likely to die from it than most other groups in the United States, both because of its early onset and the gaps in medical care. Colorectal cancer rates are also higher, much higher among indigenous peoples. Scientists necessarily approach causation with caution, yet research suggests that industrial meat is a key culprit. Diet, bacteria in the gut, and inflammation are three paths from red and processed meat to the chronic inflammation that promotes the development of malignant polyps in the human colon and rectum. But these paths are all paved with meat. A diet high in red industrial and processed meats can dramatically constrain the complexity and diversity of the gut microbiome as it does the wider biome. A key effect is chronic inflammation, which is associated with a higher preponderance for the development of malignancy. Put another way, the Western diet, a colonial commissary, can turn the gut into a cancer machine. Jennifer Terry traces how civilian health infrastructure is fashioned first to meet the changing nature of battlefield injuries. Because of the scale of U.S. militarism and the priority accorded to military care, weapons designed to kill, the specific injuries they cause to the body, and the therapeutics that they provoke, shape wider civilian knowledge and infrastructure for healing. The transformation of the U.S. food system is inseparable from the logistical war against indigenous peoples. At the center of this transformation is meat. In addition to the 200 pounds of meat per person that Americans eat on average annually, meat byproducts find their way pretty much everywhere. My niece, for instance, recently pointed out to me that my very gentrified, hipster, healthy-looking yogurt contained byproducts of both beef and pork. Following the slaughterhouse, the hospital is now a frontier for logistics, key nodes in the care chain, as it's called. Logistics amounts to 30% of tight hospital budgets. Cadres of experts work to commercialize, outsource, and reorder this division of labor. When I completed an executive course in global business logistics years ago, half of the participants were from hospitals. In the hospital, speed is often of essence. In the hospital, markets are almost as aggressive as my little brother's terminal colorectal cancer. Sorry. Almost. There we go. What infrastructural inheritances usher in an era that might best be characterized as palliative? And how might an immanent politics of care and collaboration point us towards other paths? Denial of the emergency of our present may be a polite path within the academy, but it can no longer be sustained as an empirically informed or responsible one. The entangled crises of climate and coloniality define our conjuncture, genocide our immediate present. At the same time, everyday life has long been unlivable for so many. In The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, Gerald Horne reminds us that apocalypse is a recurring experience for colonized and enslaved peoples. For Horne, apocalypse is the ghastly termination of lives and life worlds, but not the end of life itself. Maya Angelou offers, quote, "Sometimes you don't survive whole, you just survive in part. But the grandeur of life is that attempt. It's not about the solution. It's about being as fearless as one can and behaving as beautifully as one can under completely impossible circumstances." This way of apprehending apocalypse resonates with the, at least in my mind, resonates with the early atomist philosopher of both motion and death, Lucretius. For Lucretius, life is always in motion, and death needs to be apprehended in that context. Life changes form, but it does not end. Marx's own emphasis on circulation has been attributed to his engagement with Lucretius's work. Bringing palliative to politics demands neither a giving in nor a giving up. It may remind us that the most devastating loss can germinate the most extraordinary practices of care and collaboration. In attending to the radical unevenness of premature death, palliative politics calls forward a refusal of instrumentalizing orientations to life like collateral damage. It asks an empirical, not hypothetical question. It asks what we can learn from the practitioners of the radical care of life to guide us in this apocalyptic moment. In the context of the radical intimate work of health justice, Caribbean feminist Andai describes a, quote, "conspiracy of mutual caring in networks of activism and support that refuse systems of value and anti-relation that define colonial life worlds." Anishinaabe writer again, Gerald Weisenor, conjoins survival and resistance to name the radical everyday indigenous practices that refuse the replacement of native motion with colonial forms. For Weisenor, sovereign motion, what he terms transmotion, and survivance are one and the same. Native transmotion, he writes, is, quote, "directly related to the ordinary practices of survivance, a visionary resistance and sense of natural motion over separatism, literary denouement, and cultural victimry. Animated by radical palliative politics, it is not indigenous life worlds that expire, but colonial orders and relations that must pass away." In the last round of edits on our co-authored paper, Beyond Wendigo Infrastructure, Winona LeDuc inserted some prescient lines. "The Wendigo economy," she wrote, is, quote, like a cancer on Mother Earth, a cancer on our bodies, and indeed, in the world we live today, many of us will succumb to the disease." Fleming explains that in Anishinaabe legend, the Wendigo was, quote, "a giant monster, a cannibal who killed and ate our people. Colonization was our Wendigo." But the Wendigo economy and its infrastructured ecologies are not simply like a cancer, they are quite literally carcinogenic. When we ride the rails of settler land and slaughter, of premature death and logistical life, the path points, among other places, to the oncology ward. The imaginary lines segregating the wider ecology from singular bodily health may serve to insulate a form of settler unseeing, but they cannot protect against the movements and crossings of metastatic disease. As Leanne Simpson writes, quote, "What happens outside my body also happens inside my body." Looking to the work of movements and communities across Turtle Island, Winona and I insist that colonialism has no monopoly over infrastructure. Infrastructure is how sociality extends itself. It is how life in motion is provisioned or curtailed. In its most immediately material and graspable forms, infrastructure underpins sustenance and reproduction. We call infrastructure that is life-giving in its design, finance, and effects alimentary. And we insist that our collective futures hinge on remaking alimentary socio-technical systems. For example, we can look to Indigenous women who are at once fighting extractive infrastructure as they build life-giving forms. The tiny house warriors assert Secwepemc jurisdiction as they refuse the construction of a fossil fuel pipeline through their lands. Sacred Earth Solar, and here this is an image of Melina Labucan Massimo, collaborates with, sorry, I skipped ahead a little. The tiny house warriors assert Secwepemc jurisdiction as they refuse the construction of a fossil fuel pipeline through their lands. In their direct and constructive action, they build alimentary infrastructure in the form of a network of very small homes along the pipeline's path. So Sacred Earth Solar, and here now Melina Labucan Massimo works to provision these tiny homes with solar power and describes how this collaboration emerged certainly out of a shared concern for climate justice, but also specifically emerged out of concerns about violence against Indigenous women, especially when the rates of violence are exacerbated in resource extraction zones. That was a quote. Jordan Kinder writes in a recent paper called Solar Infrastructure as Media Resistance, Indigenous Solidarities Against Settler Colonialism, quote, when informed by energy justice, solarity is a form of solidarity among the human and non-human world that reorients our collective energy imaginaries from one of scarcity to one of abundance. Indigenous solidarities, then, name the myriad potentialities for doing so in ways that foreground Indigenous self-determination against and beyond extractivism. Recognizing the profound and intimate relations that bind Palestinians to their ecologies, Faik Mari describes a project of alimentary infrastructure, cooperative farms led by students from Safa in the occupied West Bank. With Ard El Ya, which literally translates into, quote, "the land of despair sprouts with hope," they not only hope to protect their land and ecology, but to establish a, quote, "resistance economy," an economy of self-reliance as the basis of a viable Palestinian liberation struggle, and one that offers dignified work opportunities, end quote. Ard El Ya has grown into one of the most successful youth cooperative and has catalyzed 20 more. In 1917, Rosa Luxemburg's efforts to organize a general strike against the war, the Great War, landed her in that Breslau prison in the same moment as the Wobblies were being locked up for organizing workers against war across the ocean. Even then, Rosa's efforts were far from futile. They also created opportunity for her to feel her way into radical and intimate relation with a life form who would otherwise remain the dead labor of military logistics. Luxemburg faced further final punishment for her fight against imperial militarism. She was killed for having a dangerous mind and a loud voice. In a body that made it already challenging to be heard in the 19-teens, female, Jewish, and disabled, she stood up and she never sat down. Her own singular embodied time on this planet was cut far too short, but her thought and her example live on and inspire other ways and other rhythms of life. I'll close with her words from another letter, but in the same year, and to the same friend from that same cell. There we go. Here I am, lying in a dark cell, upon a mattress hard as stone. The building has its usual churchyard quiet, so that one might as well be already entombed. Through the window there falls across the bed a glint of light from the lamp which burns all night in the front of the prison. At intervals I can hear faintly in the distance the noise of a passing train, or close at hand the dry cough of the prison guard as in his heavy boots he takes a few slow strides to stretch his limbs. I lie here alone and in silence, enveloped in the manifold black wrappings of darkness, tedium, unfreedom, and winter. And yet, my heart beats with an immeasurable and incomprehensible inner joy, just as if I were moving in the brilliant sunshine across a flowery mead. And in the darkness I smile at life, as if I were the possessor of charm, which would enable me to transform all that is evil and tragical into serenity and happiness. But when I search my mind for the cause of this joy, I find there is no cause and can only laugh at myself. Thank you very much. Okay, so I've opened up a lot of different terrain for questions, I realize, but I'll take them all.
I really enjoyed that, thank you. This will be an easy question to start with. I was just thinking when you were talking about red meat and cancer and so on, the other thing that came to my mind was the breeding of animals for, with the idea that in the future we'll be able to be bred for human transplant.
Yeah.
Right, so like, you know, it seems like it's possibly an extension of some of the things you're talking about, and obviously it's just an empirical question, but I wondered if you had thought through that and almost maybe generally thought through some of the sort of future, I don't know if it would be techno-utopianism of something like that, or bio-utopianism or whatever, but these kind of visions of how this train that you've been tracing out, how it may continue into the future and what other problems that would obviously entail.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much for the question. In the 4-day version of this talk, thanks. You're welcome to come over, and we'll, it can go on. I think probably as many of us experience, we sometimes have to write, and then whittle down, right? So this is one of those talks. So and at one point I remember screaming, not at my partner, but towards my partner, that I wasn't sure how on earth all this was. So it's very gestural, obviously, and kind of necessarily so. But in the 4-day version, there was actually a section on that whole question of the cultivation of especially pig organs, right? I actually just not too long ago reviewed a paper, so I don't know who the author was, so I can't cite them, but keep an eye out for a paper on this, which was called something like Pigs in Space. It was a great title for a gruesome paper. It was looking at the logistification of organ cultivation. And I think it's exactly as you're saying. So basically the scenario is, it's hard and expensive and not easy to get human organs for transplant. So there's been a tremendous amount of experimentation with especially pig tissues, because pig organs and tissues seem to work better in humans. And there's actually fairly recently, I think it was just last year, there was the first, there's been, a series of attempts to transplant things like hearts, and with increasing success. In I think the most recent case, the person actually lived with a pig heart for several months. So that this is coming, as you kind of note. I don't think this is I think it's exactly like you said, it's an extension. And I think at one point I had dropped the Jennifer Terry's, the brief reference I have to her work, and I decided I needed to put it back in because I think that her work points really to this constant attempt to sort of respond to the problem by increasingly logistification and medicalization, rather than addressing, the kinds of problems that create the need for so much transplantation. And I'm actually in the process of becoming a donor myself right now for my little brother, who you heard about, which may not happen because it might not be enough time. But so I'm kind of becoming increasingly familiar with the processes, and it is an arduous process, donor transplantation. But this paper that I had reviewed that I can't cite properly because I don't know who the author is, really gets into some of these questions, and I think we can imagine already, just based on what industrial meat supply looks like, the entire cultivation of animal life just for its parts, right? So, yeah, it's another kind of heavy part of this work, and I appreciate you raising it because I didn't get the time to, but I think it just kind of pushes exactly at what I'm laying out here. And at some point it's not to say that I don't think people need organs for transplant. Of course, that's I'm not suggesting that, but the refusal to really take stock of what is creating this need to instrumentalize non-human life in these ways, and human life, right? That's, I guess, part of the point too. Is really the critique. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, the very interesting term palliative infrastructures has deep and complicated metaphorical resonances, including fatalism and fatality, as well as anesthesia. Those seem to me to be in tension with that really wonderful quote you put up from Maya Angelou about living life in part, which has a really, if not optimistic, at least very vigorous and life-affirming movement to it. Can you talk about that tension a little bit?
Thanks for the question, because that is a part of the talk, and a part of the term, like this concept of palliative politics, which still makes me uneasy as well. But not so uneasy that I didn't want to work with it. And I'll try and give you where I'm at with it right now. It's like the first time I've talked about it publicly, although I've been thinking about it for quite some time. There's a few references, and really I think it comes to a head in when I speak to Gerald Horne's idea of apocalypse. And then there's a whole bunch of kind of conceptual infrastructure around that, including like Lucretius and the Maya Angelou quote. And part of what I take from Horne is that even what is seemingly the most final thing, right, the apocalypse, right, which is itself like a concept I never really liked to work with either. But when I read his work, I was kind of like reinvigorated in my interest in the term, because for him, he's talking about these kind of multiple apocalypses. He makes it something of a sequence that is as it's, and I think he's wed to the word because of the ways in which experiences like slavery and colonialism are apocalyptic in the sense of the complete dismantling of whole ways of being and of lives. But by making it something that recurs, and this is where I connected to kind of like Lucretius, but also the Angelou quote, and many of the examples I'm working with, including some very intimate ones that aren't in the paper, but that I'm happy to make a gesture at in a moment. The idea that lives and entire life worlds can be violently brought to an end, but that's not everything coming to an end, is to me actually that very uncomfortable place that I actually do want to think with, and I think we need to think with in moments like this, not just because of like my gestures to Palestine, but before that, climate crisis, and certainly the wider experience of colonialism on this continent. I think the grappling with, and of course the transatlantic slave trade, which is also present, in gestures in this talk, that I am pushing at something as big as apocalypse, but thought in those ways of the destruction, and often incredibly violent destruction of lives, real lives, and whole life worlds, but that's not necessarily an absolute finality. And in fact, that there is, even in those most brutal forms of seeming termination, that there is something that can not only survive, but be generative out of that process. And so some of the examples, are ones that I've pointed to. I'm always baffled by the incredible survivance, the kind that Weisner talks about, or that we can think about with Maya Angelou, right? That there's a partial survival. There's not everything survives. That her quote is maybe not as brutal as Palliative suggests. Where is it? Almost. There we are. That you don't survive whole. And I think that's some of what I'm getting at. To make a very intimate reference to this, not just about my brother, which is also obviously weighing here very much for me, but my relationship with Winona LaDuke, who we wrote this paper that has been very generative for me and in my thinking and my work in the world. She and I met. If you look at the acknowledgement in that paper, there's just one. It's to someone named Randy Kapashishit, who was her first husband and was one of my dearest friends. I didn't know Winona before he died, and then I came to know her through his death. And I was reflecting on that, not only when we acknowledged him, because he was also fighting, he spent a lot of time fighting hydro infrastructure in his community. It was moose factories from Treaty 9 territory. Milk Quebec chief. Anyways, when he passed, I started to notice that all of these relationships that became absolutely core to my life were all people that were his people, and we didn't know each other when he was alive. And I keep seeing that in so many of the worlds I travel, and so many of the losses I experience, like how many ways and forms of relation and connection emerge out of those moments. And so part of me was worried, and sorry to go on so long, but you asked a question that I really, really like. It was one of those questions that kept me up a lot at night to think about, is this irresponsible? Is this fatalistic? Will this be taken as it's inevitable that, things are coming to an end? I don't want to let go of the heaviness of the moment. I really don't, obviously. That's like my work's going there right now, but everything also points, and I say that in part as trying to be a very responsible instructor as well. I was telling some of the graduate students at the lunch that I teach a course of 800 first-year students every year, and I've been doing this for 18 years, and I do it starting in January. And what I started to realize was, it's more stressful for them when we don't start from a place that they know, which is they all read reports about the IPCC, they all know. And it may not be that they're all thinking about climate, although it's hard to find a young person that isn't. They might be thinking about the unaffordability of housing. They might be thinking about the fact that they can't get a job. Whatever it is, it's a very, very hard time, obviously, for everyone, and for unevenly for folks. But I found it was much more compelling if we started honestly from this point, and then worked, and sort of implicitly in this kind of a mode of thinking, okay, what can we do from here? Not because everything necessarily is going to come to an end, but maybe in this way, some things are, some things have, some things do, some things will. Acknowledging the suffering. I have a graduate student that lost most of a huge extended family in one night in October, right? And this is the place where we're trying to survive, if not build from. So that's some of where the palliative comes from, in addition to, some of these very intimate places. And I don't know yet, so I would love, like, if you have, if your question also comes with anything further, I would welcome it. Anyone, because I don't know if it's helpful, but it feels helpful to me. And it's felt helpful as I've thought it through with some others that I trust and care about. But it's tentative. Thank you. That was a long answer. I think the longer I'm in this field, the more I can, I don't know. Anyways.
Thank you so much. I feel very, I'm feeling a lot of feels right now, as we say. And I wanted to ask you kind of maybe a two-part question. I feel like maybe the answer will be connected. The first is kind of general, and it's just about your own method of like thinking and feeling across these scales. And I think you gestured to it in one of the answers about, a kind of moment of like, how do all these things fit together? I know that they do. So I wondered if kind of retrospectively you could look back or reflect on that process and maybe say something about how you bring all of these pieces together. And then I guess my other question was about the way that you talk about circulation and, sovereign transmotion. It seems like it's something, an important element through this is obviously the way that logistics facilitates certain forms of capitalist circulation. Dispossession acts as this kind of condition of these forms of circulation as well, but that you're emphasizing these other forms as well of like motion, movement. And I guess I wonder how, and I guess like that would, the Lucretius element, like that ties into the idea of circulation as well. So yeah, and then for me, I also see resonances of this kind of idea of like change, movement, connected with this idea here of like not surviving in whole, not necessarily like looking for the whole, but moving with loss. And I guess maybe now my question's becoming a three-part one, which is how do you
see it happens to you too.
Yeah. Thinking is doing this to me, like it's just kind of, anyways. But the last one is about like how you think about something like palliative politics in relation to something like grief, which I feel like for me maybe is a more, like I think we've all been probably like thinking and reading a lot about grief and what it means to kind of live with that as a political emotion, especially in terms of, like grappling with loss. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I'm hovering here because there's a little microphone here that I'm supposed to stay somewhat close to, so it's not because I'm like trying to hide from you behind with this lovely screen. Thanks for those beautiful questions. All of them are exciting to me and feel like they really resonate with what I'm trying to do here. Maybe I'll start with the last one because the word palliative is as our last lovely questioner kind of pointed to, there's a kind of fatalism, and it seems in the word, which is not necessarily the case with something like grief or mourning, like words that are also very present, although I've realized how present only when I started thinking about it all the time in social thought and political thought. And I haven't really seen a lot on questions of the palliative. I didn't choose it to be new. I chose it because first of all, I've lived the last year of my life in very close proximity to palliative care with my little brother, which has been, the part that's relevant is that once again I'm baffled and blown away by the care workers, even in the most strictly immediately, palliative nurses, palliative doctors, palliative workers, what they do, and especially the more radical ones, because there's some incredible radical palliative care workers. Like now I'm forgetting their name, but if you're interested, I will send it to you. There's a great little piece by these two palliative care doctors in Toronto who do work with unhoused people who are in palliative situations. Palliative care is always pretty hard, right? Pretty brutal. And providing it is also takes very special kinds of people. But to do it in that context is a whole other, and so and it's not the first time, I've been in this context. Many of us have experienced a lot of loss and been in contexts where we've come into very close proximity with people who work in that field, and I'm just amazed by what they bring to it. So this short paper that these two people whose names I can't remember, unfortunately, wrote, we're talking about it as a kind of mutual aid, which I thought was really interesting and really relevant. So in the most kind of immediate sense of palliative health care, palliative work, I think there's something extraordinary to look to, which is familiar to me, not only from intimate experiences, but also from the AIDS crisis, from other kinds of large-scale social loss that required that kind of a very politicized relationship to end of life care. But then what the term does beyond its immediate medical context, which I decided not even to talk about today, even though there's a really interesting history to that field of healthcare as well. It's not necessarily focusing on after death, which grief and mourning does. And so it is like a certain kind of fatalism, a certain kind of knowing that some kind of end is coming is the concept, right? It is the challenge. And I think the only thing that salvages it, but is crucial, is this, right? Is what we were just talking about in terms of the Gerald Horne and that it's not all things that end. But I think the acceptance of finality of a certain kind at a certain scale is actually vital to what I'm working through with it. I'm going to leave it there because I'm taking up so much time, and you had two other really important questions. Methodologically, I would say, just to be brief, believe it or not, this is a following the infrastructure project. Sometimes you follow things intentionally, and sometimes things get thrown at you. There's a whole part of this project that's not even here, although it's kind of here, which is so I was working really centrally on railroad and railroad colonialism, as I think you probably know from our past conversations. And when I came across this Rosa Luxemburg letter, and I was really moved by it for so many reasons, but this combination of war and imperialism and this relationship to the buffalo is, even though it's a different species of buffalo and it's a different continent, and I just kept thinking about it, and it wasn't immediately connected to the archive I was working with, but it felt related. And in some ways there's a missing piece, although I hope it sort of worked in terms of thinking about interspecies, relationality, grief, suffering, the question of the human that I'm also not really resolved on, somewhere between Moten and Sylvia Wynter, with what I think about the human. But there's also a whole archive I came across, the accidental archive, which was because when COVID started, I was supposed to be on a research leave. Not the best time, because I spent most of it changing elders' diapers and cooking for ill people and stuff, not really getting a lot of research done, and everything closed, right? All the archives were closed, except there's one archive, a Jewish archive in Montreal, that scanned thousands of pages for me, and it was amazing because I wasn't even planning to incorporate this. This wasn't on my, when we write those, students in the room, you'll know when you write your nice SHRC applications, we were talking about how sometimes useful and not those opportunities to write applications are. This was not in any of my research applications for anything, but I heard a reference to the Jewish Colonization Association, and I became really intrigued because there was this massive effort starting in the 1890s to kind of save the Eastern European Jews, and a very important railway baron who was German Jewish or Austrian Jewish created this foundation, or this kind of strange, it's a complicated thing, but kind of known as one of the largest charities ever, like in terms of its financial scale, which is called in English, the Jewish Colonization Association. And they tried to move Jews out of the Pale into Canada, the United States, Argentina, and eventually Palestine. And really fascinating. There's all kinds of what I'm seeing as indentured labor that was happening. There's, it's both a forced movement and a rescue mission, but it's also a colonization project and named as such, and becomes very important in terms of the histories of Palestine and Israel. So that's not in this talk, but that's also present. And I'm just saying that because things happen that are accidents in our research too. But I like that I like that that's part of where the project has gone. Sometimes it's not intentional, and sometimes, like this whole talk, I didn't feel like I was writing. I felt like it was kind of moving through me in this weird way. Maybe that's a good place to go on the last one, and I'll try and actually be brief, because I said I was going to be brief in the last question on circulation. I mean, I've been working on circulation for a long time, and even my earliest work as a doctor, like, I guess I was working before then, but like the first, work that gets published as a book, my doctoral work was on military welfare, which is in a sense the histories of logistics, which come out of warfare and provisioning soldiers and moving munitions and of course moving populations and as we heard today, like destroying food supplies for other populations and so forth. And I think for a long time I was really focused on capitalist and imperial forms of circulation and infrastructure, but circulation and logistics in particular. And I think implicitly, because I'm also someone who's very involved in activism and organizing and community stuff, I know and I see and I insist that there's other ways. But I think it was Leanne Simpson first that really made me think about other forms of motion and life in motion. And then all kinds of sources. When you start thinking about something, you just see it everywhere. So motion, and as you pointed out, change, are like black radical thought. It's, the idea of motion and change is enormous. Then Gerald Weisner, who I found through Leanne Simpson initially. And what it became, and then I read a book called Marx in Motion, which I cited in here by Thomas Nail, which was really helpful because he talks about capitalism not as motion against, something else, stasis, but about capitalism as a regime of motion. And the capitalist regime of motion, probably many of us know if you're trained in political economy, Capital, Volume 1, 2, and 3. This is capitalist motion. But what I've been increasingly interested in over the last few years is thinking about its others. And I think when you come to the question of infrastructure, and like Leanne Simpson talks about, like literally, dams disrupting and destroying the kinds of circulations that were vital and remain vital to her people, then you start to think like, oh right, like of course, these are competing forms of circulation and motion. And oftentimes colonial and imperial forms of circulation and motion are actively disrupting and destroying other forms, indigenous forms, and so forth. There's a lot more I could say about that. I think Lauren Berlant fits in really nicely with that when you start to think about infrastructure then as a means of ordering motion in a sense. It started to fit together in these ways. So sometimes maybe also, I'll just add again for maybe the more anxious scholars in the room, because there is a lot of anxiety in this moment. Sometimes when you don't get things done quickly, on time, for years, there's benefits, which is like your thought, there's things that start to cycle back, you start to see things, you start to make connections that if I had moved faster with this work, which for some of the reasons that we've been talking about today, I haven't been able to, some of these connections I probably wouldn't have had the slow thought to see. So thanks for very beautiful questions and generative ones.
Thank you very much. When you gave the opening kind of quote from Luxemburg, I couldn't help but see, just in my mind, the parallels with Nietzsche and the horse. But Nietzsche, of course, kind of imploded and collapsed after that, where it seems like Rosa was more like empowered in the thought of this like vision going forward. How do you stay more like with Luxemburg, and how do you stay positive in all of these times working with such heavy topics and don't kind of implode like Nietzsche did?
How do I stay positive with thinking with Luxemburg?
Well, yeah, how do you stay more like positive working in this space that can be very heavy and not kind of implode then?
Thank you. I mean, it's a great question. This is actually some of the least positive that I get. Like this ending, I mean, people who know me, and maybe you already feel like you do, even if you don't, I hope a little bit. I don't think I'm like positive and an optimist, but I do spend my entire night and day and everything in between looking for possibility, looking for, ways we can move differently. This is actually the most ambivalent ending place I've ever had in a talk, But it's kind of beautiful. I mean, I think the most honest answer to your question, though, is the whole talk, which is, and this question of the palliative, which, what I'm trying to do is certainly not like put on a happy face, obviously. But what I am trying to say, and what I do genuinely, honestly, totally, fully believe, and not just on a personal level, but intellectually and politically, is this idea of what is generative in these moments. And the only hesitation I have about that is I don't ever want to sound like I'm like making the violence okay, But all these examples I'm offering, whether it's through these beautiful forms of alimentary infrastructure, as we've called them, these ones that I'm pointing to today that aren't necessarily in my work with Winona, but that come out of this kind of thinking, which are all emerging out of like deeply violent and brutal contexts. I would say that, so this at the very least, I find there is no cause. I can only laugh at myself. Like that's for me, that's like the worst I get. Is like, I can't really tell you why I have this faith, and I think it has to be a little bit more than secular at this point. But most days, I would say, and I would say even in this moment, we're all, I shouldn't say that ever, but in different ways, many of us were talking over the since I've been here in the city since yesterday, about exhaustion, right? And whether because of the strike, whether because of Israel-Palestine, whether because of ongoing other things and other forms of violence that people have been fighting for so long, whether still from COVID, there's so many things that lead to exhaustion, but many are coming together in very intense ways over the last little while. And someone said to me the other day, like, you must be so tired, because I've been, like, my usual busyness, like, really ramped up, because I'm very involved in especially Jewish organizing against the war and the ceasefire and against this violence and genocidal violence. But then I paused and I had to like literally say to this person, I actually want to go back to that when you said you must be so exhausted, because I'm underslept, I'm a little ragged, you can probably hear my voice even. But I also really feel that in this moment, like I've never been, when I open like my phone, there's like a gazillion messages from the most extraordinary, amazing, brave, beautiful, bold people who are also exhausted, but who are stepping up and stepping out and like going and going. And I'm not saying we need to like always do this. I'm not saying that in itself is a good thing, but I've never been so surrounded by so much care and so many inspiring people. And I feel, I certainly feel tired, and I think that these moments and these experiences can be obviously devastating, but they also sometimes bring out the most extraordinary things. And this is when I say it's not a hypothetical question. I spent some time in my friend's community in Treaty 3 this summer because there was a loss in the community. It's an Anishinaabe community, and I had the opportunity to be at ceremony for many days. And I mean, it was breathtaking to see how people held each other and how it's a very, very tragic loss that was in a series of losses. I see the same thing in a lot of the Black feminist worlds, that like Ndai is was a mentor of my partner's, and is there's a beautiful book of her writing that's come out a little while ago. So when I say it's not a hypothetical question, this question of conjoining the palliative and politics, when we think with like Ruth Gilmore about premature death and racism, and we think about people's, nations, groups that have had to survive these kinds of apocalyptic experiences, as Horn would describe them. The extraordinary creativity, the extraordinary care, that is baffling in its beauty to me, and I feel immersed in relations that gesture at that right now. So I think both things are true at the same time. And maybe that's the tension that you highlighted in your first, earlier question. Yeah. Does that? Yeah. I don't know what I should say to the microphone.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to come back again. And so I know we're going over this ground over and over again. And
It's helpful.
Obviously, it's also very personal. Like you said, so many of us have gone through this. And I'm wondering whether this idea of the palliative, from what I understand, I'm not a geographer, I'm a literary and cultural studies scholar, but this idea, I'm curious to hear like what you might think about it as a kind of temporal concept. The idea that we're not rushing towards a cure, the cure provides more suffering, and the fact that going towards palliative care or infrastructure means being present in the most deeply difficult way. And really paying attention to symptoms or paying attention to suffering, but not imagining that you are going to have a particular kind of solution to the entire, evil, all that is evil and tragical. So I was wondering what you thought about that, just in terms of, I guess, acceleration, slowing down, speed, and then kind of like, almost like capitalist goals of success.
Thank you for that really interesting question. I mean, it's interesting, and I try and keep this tight. I'm so like, I don't know what to say. It just is. Get up and leave when you need to, slap me, I don't know. But these are big questions, and they're ones I'm like really interested in, and I appreciate the question. Speed is so interesting. I gave a very different talk, but the first time I talked about anything related to this, and I didn't use the language of palliative, started with, and I used music, like electronic music, but it started because of my brother's heart rate, and I had the beat, and then I also had railway track, like I used all this sound, because last year around this time, or it was a little later, when he was first diagnosed, they took out all my brother's organs, right, and they did this thing called oh my god, never mind. They did this surgery where they basically took out a whole whack of organs, and then he's got bags and all that. And so he was in the hospital for a while, and I was literally going from my 800 student class to the hospital, which was not very far away. If you know Toronto, you'll know that like the hospital row is right near the U of T downtown campus. And then I'd go back to class, like I'd stay there, and then I'd go back to class, sometimes like wearing the same clothes, just like switching out like a t-shirt or whatever, jacket. And so there's this temporality was like at the center of everything I was thinking about. It's so funny. I just lost a thought that was connecting things, but so I was playing with sound a lot at that point. I wouldn't say that. So there's this question of slowing down, which I think is part of it. But it's also a disorientation of time in some ways, because there's also speeding ups that happen in these processes. I really wish I might need to get your email address, because I had this, that's why I said, I'm warning you, this might go on a bit, because I had like a whole line of thought that's not accessible to me right this second. See, it can happen to all of us. For those, again, like just the anxious graduate student moment. someone had said, you know, that they get really anxious that they're going to say something stupid in front of their advisor. And I was like, you can say something stupid and it gets recorded in a camera. And here you go. But I really do want to come back to your thought. So you were talking about speed and temporality.
Being present versus kind of racing towards a cure or causing more suffering in the bid for some kind of unpredictable future, unforeseeable kind of future.
Yeah.
The idea of just like being the palliative to me is infrastructure that, from what you're saying, attends to the moment.
Yeah.
And with perhaps no hope of the future. But
Yeah, and I think that I really appreciate how you said that, because you articulated things that I haven't yet. That presence in the moment. I mean, it's both the inevitability, in a sense, is both the draw and my fear of the concept. I was very worried about a sense of, like, that's why I actually have a line about it's like the giving up and giving in. Like, I don't mean it like that, and I don't think it needs to be that. But of course, like, I'm thinking about people who would have a very bad reaction to anything that points towards something necessarily. Like, there's a necessity of the terminal here, right? It's not just a possibility. That is troubling. But I think that is important, and I think that tension is where I do want to carefully dwell right now. I would love to get your email address if I can, because this thought will come back to me, and then maybe I can send it to you, and we can have a little exchange. I don't think this is necessarily a geography project in a simple sense, but I do think it's not possible without geography. I'll say in that motion. To me, I mean, motion is, as I think about it, and I would attribute this largely to Doreen Massey's influence on my thought, which is, like, I'm constantly amazed and reminded, like, I teach her work every year to this big class, and just this one paper, just the idea of, just the concept of power geometries, how much it gives me new thoughts all the time. And I think motion, which is simultaneously time and space, and is necessarily about change, requires a kind of sensitivity and orientation towards geography, but also many, many other things like temporality and historicity. So thank you for your question. Sorry I lost my train. Yeah.
This might have to be the last one.
It's not so much a question. I think just one of the things that I think is really compelling about the thinking that you're doing, or asking us to do around the palliative. I think about, right, the biopolitical and this kind of letting die or making die, and the necropolitical. And I think you're asking us to think about death, right? What other ways of being present with and for death might be possible and might need to be part of a politics. Right? I mean, queer theory, I think, is taking this, sort of the Edelman, sort of that it's hard to think about the political without a future, right, or without life. That what would it mean to sit with death as, so not as a giving up or a giving in, but like, the palliative is giving us maybe a way to think about, not the MAID model, or, right, but these other ways of imagining infrastructures for death that are not deadly or genocidal. That feels compelling to me. So thank you. It's not a question so much.
No, I appreciate it. I'm glad, and I appreciate it, and I do think, I mean, the line from Fred Moten about kind of refusing, like, a reinvestment in humanity, which I think is so interesting, and especially, like, because I do keep it in tension with kind of a Sylvia Winter thinking on the question of the human, but I was really taken with that. But in that same interview, and some of you may have seen it, it was he did a conversation. I can't remember the source. I have it written down somewhere, but the name of the podcast. But it was like a interview. It was a video, but usually it's just a podcast series that was in maybe October 14th, or very, very soon after the 7th. And he, at one point, it's like there's a lot of really interesting parts of that conversation, but at one point he says something which I think is really important and complicated to hold, and something that we don't always hold in kind of progressive political thought. He says something about there is a certain that life necessarily kind of, if not extinguishes, takes up space from other forms. And I think that's a really difficult idea in some ways, but it's also, in terms of a frustration with like right space or purely right space thinking, political thought, I think it's really important. I think it is really important to, and this is where I think Lucretius and other ways of thinking that that require these hard questions. And that's not to say that certainly the kinds of like apocalyptic forms of violent imperial end of life, that I don't think is by any means necessary, but that life doesn't necessarily involve. It's not like there's not a utopianism to thinking of always everywhere, life being, that question of finality is necessary for us to contend with. And I feel like, much like I felt like when I started working on war early on, and war is a question of politics and that often gets kind of made exceptional within political thought, I think there's something similar that the opening quote from Audre Lorde points to, which is like, we need to be able to bring the question of death into life without, like I think she says, without succumbing to it, but also without sidelining it or ignoring it or pretending that it, and I guess the reference I made to my friend, it was Al Hunter, just to attribute the communities, Rainy River First Nation, when I mentioned I visited this summer, like there are so many traditions other than Euro-Western ones that are so much better at holding loss and death and moving forward despite and with all that comes with that. I mean, that's sort of what I'm pointing to with some of the sources of my learning from the question of how I'm framing it as palliative. But I think that is crucial, and I think the attempt to sort of avoid is itself so destructive, and I think anyone who's experienced really significant loss knows that very well. It's like the paucity of resources in so much kind of mainstream culture and Euro-Western culture around holding, in this case, grief or mourning is really clear. So that's sort of the trajectory of thought here. Thanks for your comment. We survive.
I think we can put a bookmark here.
Hopefully in whole.
Let's give a
Thank
round
you.
of applause.